Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's biggest moments, the French Revolution.
Oh, the French Revolution. Now there's a story.
I know, we've got a ton of sources here, and it's amazing it's not just some boring history lesson.
Not at all.
We're talking about kings escaping in disguise, and they even tried to get rid of Sundays once.
They did, with a whole new calendar.
Wild. And you know, the guillotine, they were still using that in France up until 1981.
Can you imagine? It's just incredible how much this period still shapes our world today, you know?
It's true. But, okay, before we get to all that drama, we need to understand what France was like before everything went boom.
Right, we have to set the scene.
So picture this. You're born into a world where your entire life is basically decided for you from day one.
Yeah.
Just because of your family.
It's hard to wrap your head around that kind of social structure now, isn't it?
Completely.
But that was France back then. They had what they called the three estates. You had the clergy, the nobility, and then everyone else lumped into the third estate.
So like the haves, the have-mores, and the have-nothings.
Pretty much. And the crazy part is the third estate, they were the vast majority of the population, but they had zero power, no privileges.
Oh, that's often.
They paid all the taxes while the clergy and the nobility, they were living it up, exempt from all that. Talk about inequality.
Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
Hey.
Someone was bound to get upset eventually.
Oh, they did. The third estate, they started speaking out more and more, demanding reforms, especially as these Enlightenment ideas of liberty and equality started spreading. But the funny thing is, the real catalyst for change, it came from the top, from King Louis VI himself.
No way, the king. He helped start the whole thing that would lead to his downfall.
He did. He was in a tough spot, facing this massive financial crisis. The royal family was spending like crazy. There were all these costly wars. And then on top of it all, bad harvests, one after the other.
So basically, he was broke.
Basically. So he's desperate for solutions. He tries tax reforms, even targets the nobility, imagine that. But to get them on board, he makes this decision that completely backfires.
Oh, no. What did he do?
He decides to call a meeting of the Estates General, an assembly with representatives from all three estates. And get this, it was the first time they'd met in over 175 years.
Oh, so he basically gave a platform to the people who were most unhappy with how things were going?
Exactly. The Estates General became this huge venting session for the Third Estate. They aired all their grievances. They wanted a fair system of representation. I mean, the voting process was a joke. The clergy and the nobility, a tiny percentage of the population, their votes could always overrule the entire Third Estate.
Oh, that's so unfair. What happened next? Did the king just ignore them?
At first, they tried to keep things the same, stick to the old ways.
Of course.
But the Third Estate, they weren't having it. They saw this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Yeah, I bet.
So they did something incredibly bold. They declared themselves the National Assembly, saying they were the ones who truly represented the French people.
Wow. That's a power move if I've ever heard one. So they basically said, we're done with your rig system. We're in charge now.
Yeah, basically. It was a huge turning point. People were excited, but others were terrified.
I can imagine.
Then on June 20th, 1789, they couldn't even get into their regular meeting hall, so they all met at a nearby tennis court, an indoor tennis court.
Okay.
And there, they took this oath, the famous tennis court oath. They vowed not to leave until they'd written a new constitution for France.
The tennis court oath. I've heard of that. That image is so powerful. Just an oath taken on a tennis court.
But it changed everything. It was this defiant act of self-determination, a sign that things were changing forever. Word of this spread like wildfire. It gave some people hope, and others, well, let's just say they were scared.
I can only imagine. And this is where things really start to heat up, right? Because this all leads to the storming of the Bastille.
Exactly. The Bastille, it was the symbol of royal power, of oppression. All that anger and frustration the people had, it was all directed right at the Bastille.
Right. I remember learning about that. So how did we get from a political standoff to a full-on uprising?
Well, tensions were already high in Paris. The economy was a mess. Bread prices were skyrocketing, and there were rumors about royal troops gathering outside the city. People were afraid there was going to be a crackdown on the revolution.
Yikes, that's scary.
It was a powder keg just waiting to explode. And then on July 14th, 1789, it happened. This massive crowd, they wanted weapons, they wanted ammunition. They stormed the Bastille, determined to take control of it.
Wow. I bet that was a crazy scene.
It was utter chaos, a real fight, fueled by desperation, anger, and this thirst for change. You had ordinary people, shopkeepers, artisans, even some soldiers who'd switch sides.
So it wasn't an army, just normal people pushed to their breaking point.
Exactly. It was a true people's uprising. And you know, the Bastille, it was a fortress, but the crowd, they were relentless. They were determined. After hours of fighting, the governor surrendered and the Bastille fell.
That must have been an incredible moment for the revolutionaries. Did they get what they came for? Did they find weapons?
It was more than just getting weapons. It was symbolic. It showed the people that they could defeat even the most powerful symbols of oppression. And yeah, they did see some weapons, but the real victory was the psychological impact. It sent shockwaves through France. The revolution wasn't just talk anymore. It was a force to be reckoned with.
Wow. So things were really starting to change.
Yeah.
And then the revolution spread beyond Paris.
It did. It went out into the countryside. That's when the Great Fear started.
The Great Fear. That sounds terrifying. What was that all about?
Imagine a wave of panic and rumors sweeping through all these rural towns and villages. You have to remember, these peasants were already struggling. They were poor. They were treated unfairly. Then they start hearing stories of these bandits, vengeful nobles coming to get them.
So they were scared.
Absolutely. They were scared for their lives, for their homes, for everything. So they did what they had to do. They armed themselves, formed militias, and started attacking manor houses. You know, those were like the symbols of the feudal system they hated so much.
So all this fear, just based on rumors,
Yeah.
actually created the chaos that they were afraid of.
Yeah, it's a prime example of how quickly things can fall apart when people are scared and uncertain. But you know what? Amidst all this chaos, something amazing happened. The peasants, seeing what was happening in Paris, they rose up and they actually dismantled the feudal system.
They did, just like that.
They destroyed records, they refused to pay dues, they demanded a fairer share of land and resources. They weren't going to be pushed around anymore.
Wow. So the revolution really did change things for everyone, not just the people in Paris. It was a big deal, especially for the people in the countryside.
It was.
But what about the National Assembly? Were they just watching all this happen, or were they actually trying to build a new France?
Oh, they were busy. They were laying the groundwork for a brand new society. In August 1789, they adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen.
Ah, that's a famous one.
It's one of the most important documents in history. It basically said that everyone has fundamental rights, the right to liberty, equality, and fraternity. It's inspired revolutions and reforms all over the world.
It's amazing how those ideas, which seem so obvious to us now, were considered radical and revolutionary back then.
They were. It's like a whole different world.
So what impact did this declaration have?
It became the guiding principle for all the reforms the National Assembly was putting in place. They made huge changes, reorganized France into departments, reformed the courts, changed the whole tax system to make it fairer.
It's like they were hitting reset on everything.
They were, but then there was the church. You know, the church was really powerful in France under the old system.
Like they had all that land and influence. So how did the revolution affect them?
They became a target. The National Assembly, they wanted to weaken the church's power, so they took control of church property. All those vast lands and resources, the National Assembly took them over.
Wow. That's a bold move. Did the church just sit back and let them do that?
No, not really. This move, and something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, well, that caused a huge rift in French society.
What did that do?
Well, it made priests and bishops into elected officials. They basically became employees of the state.
So the revolution wasn't just about politics, it was about religion too.
Yeah, they were trying to change the whole relationship between church and state. And that, of course, created a lot of tension and division.
Right. So how did the clergy and the people who were devout Catholics react to all this?
It was a mixed bag. Some clergy members, they went with the flow, swore allegiance to the revolution, but others, they refused. They were called refractory priests. That led to a lot of persecution, you know, and it fueled the counter-revolution. It was a very complicated issue that would have a big impact on the revolution.
Yeah, it sounds like things were getting pretty complicated. So what about the king? What was he doing during all of this? Did he just watch his power slip away?
King Louis XVI. Oh, he was in a tough spot. They took away most of his authority. He was scared of the radicals and worried about his family. So he made this big decision that really threw things into chaos. In June of 1791, he tried to escape from France with his whole family.
The famous flight to Varennes. That's a story for the ages.
Yeah.
But you know what? Before we jump into that dramatic escape and what happened after, let's take a breath and think about what we've learned so far. It's incredible how quickly things changed in France. From the storming of the Bastille to all these reforms the National Assembly made, it just shows you the power of ideas and how determined people can be to make things better.
Yeah, it really was a whirlwind of change. And that flight to Varennes, well, that just threw fuel on the fire.
It's kind of funny when you think about it. A king disguised as a nobody crammed into a carriage with his whole family trying to sneak out of the country. It's like something out of a movie.
Yeah.
What made Louis XVI think that was a good idea?
He was backed into a corner, you know. He had to accept this constitution that took away most of his power, and all those reforms the National Assembly were making, well, they were dismantling everything he stood for.
I bet he wasn't too happy about that.
Not at all. Plus, there were all these radicals in Paris, people who wanted a republic. They were a direct threat to him, to his whole family.
So he saw getting out as his only option. But where was he even going? Did he have a plan, or was it just a desperate run for it?
The plan, if you can call it that, was to get to Varennes. It's in northeastern France, near the border with Austria.
Okay.
He was hoping to join up with some royalist supporters there and eventually, start a counter-revolution, get his throne back.
It sounds risky. Did he really think he could just slip out of Paris unnoticed?
The whole escape was a mess, poorly planned, and even worse execution. They dressed up as servants, piled into this giant, obvious carriage, moving slowly and attracting attention everywhere they went.
It sounds like a comedy of errors. Weren't there a bunch of times they almost got caught?
Oh, yeah, there were so many close calls. A broken axle slowed them down. They got questioned by suspicious villagers. A former valet even recognized him. It's amazing they made it as far as they did.
Yeah. So how did they get so close to Varennes if they were leaving such a clear trail? What finally tripped them up?
Bad luck, mostly, and a very sharp postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet.
Okay.
He knew what the king looked like from a banknote. You know how they put pictures of famous people on money?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So Drouet spotted Louis XVI at an inn and immediately alerted the authorities. And that was the end of their little adventure.
Why, talk about a close shave. What a story.
Yeah.
How did people in Paris react when they heard the news?
It was a shock. That escape attempt, it just shattered any trust that was left between the monarchy and the revolutionaries. It proved what they'd been suspecting all along, that Louis XVI wasn't playing along with the reforms. He was actively working against them.
So that was pretty much the end of any hope for a peaceful transition to a constitutional monarchy.
Yeah, it was a turning point. It pushed people towards more radical ideas, like getting rid of the monarchy altogether and starting a republic.
So things got even more intense.
Definitely. The stakes were higher than ever. France was at war with itself and with other countries that saw the revolution as a threat. Austria and Prussia, they were scared those revolutionary ideas would spread, so they started getting ready to invade France and put the king back in power.
So now they're dealing with threats from inside and outside France. What did the revolutionaries do?
Things took a dark turn. The revolution became more radical. They needed to hold on to their power and silence anyone who opposed them, especially with the threat of invasion. That's when the Reign of Terror began.
Ah, the Reign of Terror. I've heard about that, but it sounds pretty scary. It's like a byword for violence and paranoia. Who was in charge? What were they trying to do?
This group, called the Committee of Public Safety, they basically became the government in 1793. They had all the power. And the guy running the show, Maximilien Robespierre, he was a charismatic leader, but ruthless, and he believed that terror was the only way to protect the revolution and create a truly virtuous republic.
Robespierre, he's the face of the Reign of Terror. He's always portrayed as this, bloodthirsty tyrant. Was he really that bad?
It's hard to say for sure. He's a complicated figure, a brilliant speaker, totally dedicated to those revolutionary ideals, especially virtue and equality. But he also believed that the ends justified the means. Anyone who stood against the revolution or even questioned it, they were enemies, and they had to be dealt with swiftly and harshly.
So he was okay with using violence to achieve his goals. What did that actually look like?
Imagine mass arrests, trials that were basically just for show, and executions. The guillotine, which was supposed to be a quick and humane way of execution, it became the symbol of this bloodthirsty period. Tens of thousands of people were executed.
Wow, it sounds terrifying. Who were they executing? Just nobles and people who opposed the revolution?
It wasn't that simple. Sure, lots of nobles, clergy, people suspected of being royalists, they were targets. But it went way beyond that. Anyone who spoke out against the government, criticized the revolution, or even didn't seem enthusiastic enough, they could be denounced, arrested, and even executed.
It sounds like a witch hunt. Was anyone brave enough to speak out against it?
Some did, even from within the revolution. They said the terror had gone too far, that it was betraying the revolution's ideals. But speaking out against Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety was incredibly dangerous. A lot of them ended up being accused of treason and suffered the same fate as those they were trying to protect.
That's tragic. So the revolution started with all these great ideas of freedom and fairness, and then it became this terrifying, violent thing. It's a strange turn of events. Did Robespierre have any plans for how to get back to a normal, peaceful society?
The reign of terror couldn't go on forever. It was too much. In the end, Robespierre's own violence caught up with him. In July 1794, the members of the National Convention, they were scared they were next, so they turned on Robespierre, arrested him, and had him executed.
Wow, that's some serious karma. He created this system of terror, and then it turned on him. Did that bring an end to the violence?
His downfall, which they called the Thermidorian reaction, it was a big change. The reign of terror started to wind down. Things calmed down a bit, and people were desperate for stability. The executions stopped, at least for a while. But the revolution wasn't over yet. France still had to deal with the aftermath of all that violence, the war with other countries, and the really big challenge of creating a stable government that could last.
So even after all that, things were still really uncertain for France. What happened next?
It wasn't a very strong peace, you know? After the Reign of Terror, this new government came in, the Directory. They were trying to bring some stability back to France, find some middle ground.
I see.
But it was a tough job. They had all these different groups pulling them in different directions. They had to keep everyone happy, the revolutionaries, the people who wanted the king back. It was a balancing act.
So even after all that upheaval, France was still kind of teetering on the edge.
Yeah.
Did the Directory manage to hold things together, or was it just setting the stage for more chaos?
Well, it wasn't easy for them. The country was worn out from years of revolution and war. The economy was a disaster, and there was so much division in the government. It was hard to keep things running smoothly.
Yeah, I can imagine. It sounds like a really tough situation to inherit.
Yeah.
Were there any good things that happened during this time, or was it just a constant fight to survive?
They had some wins, you know. They kind of stabilized the currency. And things were a little bit more orderly for a while, but they had a lot of problems with corruption, and it was hard to keep the people on their side.
So it was a bit of a mixed bag, some good, some bad. What was the final straw for the Directory? Was there one big event that led to their downfall?
There were a few things, but the biggest problem was those ongoing wars with other European countries.
Oh, right. I forgot about those. They were fighting wars this whole time.
Yeah, they inherited those wars from the previous governments. And even though they won some battles, it was really draining. All those resources going to the war effort, it just added to the instability.
Right. So it wasn't just about internal problems. They were dealing with international conflicts, too. It sounds exhausting.
It was. These weren't just border disputes either. They were fighting over ideas. It was revolutionary France against all the kings and empires of Europe. And after some early victories, things started going downhill in the late 1790s. They were facing a lot of enemies.
So it sounds like things were pretty dire for the Directory. Were people looking for a new leader, someone strong who could bring back order and win those wars?
That's exactly what happened, and that's where Napoleon Bonaparte comes in.
Ah, Napoleon. He's a big name in history. Military genius, ambitious, that famous hat. How did he take over and bring the French Revolution to an end?
Well, Napoleon, he was a brilliant military strategist, and he'd made a name for himself during the revolution. He saw an opportunity with the Directory struggling and people looking for a strong leader. In November 1799, he and a bunch of politicians and military leaders staged a coup d'etat.
Wow. So he just took over.
Yeah, pretty much. It was the end of the Directory and the start of Napoleon's rule. He became the first consul of France.
So, in a way, they went from rejecting one absolute ruler to having another one, even if he was a bit more modern. Was that a betrayal of the revolution or just a sign of the times?
That's a tough question. Historians still debate that. On the one hand, yeah, it was the end of the revolution and the idea of a truly democratic republic. But on the other hand, Napoleon kept some of the changes the revolution brought, like ending feudalism and making the legal system fairer.
So it's a complex legacy, like so much of the French Revolution. Looking back at all of this, all the chaos and bloodshed, what do you think was the most important thing the revolution did for France and for the rest of the world?
Oh, that's a big question. The French Revolution, it's one of the most important events in history. It was this radical experiment in social and political change. It inspired revolutions and reforms all over the world.
It's amazing how those ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity, they started in France, but they spread everywhere. They challenged the old ways and got people thinking about building a better world.
Absolutely. It's still relevant today. And yeah, the French Revolution was messy. There was a lot of violence and tragedy, but it shows you how powerful ideas can be, how much people want freedom and control over their own lives.
It's been fascinating exploring all the twists and turns of the French Revolution. The storming of the Bastille, the Reign of Terror, the flight to Varennes, Napoleon's rise to power. It's all so dramatic. It's a story about the human desire for change, for a better world. I hope this deep dive has inspired you to learn more about this period, to dig into those stories and think about how it all still affects us today.
It's a story that never gets old, you know? It reminds us that the fight for freedom and equality, it's something we always have to work at. And who knows, maybe you'll find something new in all the sources we've talked about. A new perspective, a forgotten story, something that will make you see this amazing chapter in history in a whole new light.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the French Revolution. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep that revolutionary spirit alive.